The rain fell like a curtain of secrets, hiding the world beyond the trembling pines. In the heart of that storm stood Thomas Grady, a weathered farmer at 73, his eyes tracing the blur of a gravel road from his porch. A chipped mug of coffee warmed his calloused hands, but it was his heart, steady, unspoken, shaped by years of tempests both overseas and at home, that saw her first. A girl no older than 18, soaked and silent, walking alone through the downpour. Her steps carried the weight of someone who'd run too far, her eyes holding a story too heavy for words. In that moment, Thomas didn't ask who she was or why she wandered. He simply opened his barn door and offered her shelter, unaware that this quiet act of kindness would weave their lives into a night that would echo far beyond the storm. The rain hammered down, relentless, a deluge that felt more like a reckoning than a storm. It pounded the tin roof of Thomas Grady's barn, each drop a sharp rebuke against the weathered metal. The wind howled, bending the pines along the gravel road until they seemed to bow under the weight of the sky's fury. It was the kind of night that made even the hardiest ranchers check their gates twice and hunker down by their fires. But Thomas, at 73, wasn't like most. A farmer now, a soldier once, he'd faced worse than storms, both the kind that raged outside and the kind that churned within. He stood at his kitchen window, one hand cradling a chipped mug of black coffee, the other steady against the sill. The old farmhouse groaned softly under the wind's assault, a sound he found comforting, proof the place still held strong. Beyond the porch, the gravel road snaking through his land was a faint smear of gray, barely visible through the sheets of rain and the trembling silhouettes of trees. That's when he saw her, a lone figure, slight and drenched, trudging through the downpour. No coat, no umbrella, just a sweater clinging to her thin frame like a second skin, soaked and heavy. Her steps were uneven, not frantic but exhausted, the gait of someone who'd been walking too long with nowhere to go. Thomas set his mug down with a soft clink. That road wasn't one people walked at night, especially not in weather like this, not unless they were out of options. He shrugged on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The wind slapped him sideways, driving cold rain through the seams of his flannel. He squinted into the storm, his boots crunching on the wet gravel as he approached the gate. "Hey!" he called, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority. "You okay out there?" The girl stopped dead, turning slowly. Her face, pale and slick with rain, caught the faint glow of his flashlight. She looked young, 17, maybe 18, but her eyes held something heavier, something that didn't match her age. Not fear exactly, but a kind of stunned disbelief, like she couldn't quite trust the world to let her stand still. Thomas tilted the flashlights slightly, letting her see his face, weathered but kind. "I've got a barn," he said, keeping his tone low, unshaken. "Dry roof, wood stove. Nothing much, but it's better than drowning out here." She hesitated, taking a step back, then two forward, as if weighing him against the storm. Finally, she gave a small nod. Thomas led the way, pulling open the barn's side door with a creak of rusty hinges. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of hay, pine, and a faint trace of time. He lit a propane lantern, its soft glow spilling across the rough wooden walls, and pulled a wool blanket from a shelf, military surplus, thick and clean. He handed it to her with care. "Canteen's by the bench. Heater will warm up once the generator settles." She took the blanket, clutching it close, and sank onto a low cot he'd unfolded in the corner. Thomas didn't press her. Some burdens he knew were heavier than rain. He tipped his hat, giving her space, and stepped back into the storm. The tempest stretched into the night, thunder rumbling deep in the hills like footsteps stalking the dark. Inside the barn, the air held a steady warmth, though it carried a weight of its own. The propane heater hummed in the corner, just strong enough to dry her sodden clothes, but not enough to thaw her silence. Thomas returned later with a tin mug of soup and a folded towel. She hadn't moved much, still perched on the cot, the blanket wrapped around her like a shield. Her eyes followed him, not with fear but with a sharp, calculating edge, as if trust was something she'd learned to ration. He set the mug on a wooden stool beside her. "Potato and corn," he said, brushing his hands on his coat. "Won't win any awards, but it'll warm you up." She glanced at the soup but didn't reach for it. Thomas didn't push. He'd seen enough in his time to know some questions were best left unasked. Instead, he moved to the generator panel by the tool shelf, tweaking a switch until the heater's rhythm steadied. When he turned back, she was holding the mug, not drinking, just cradling it in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft but deliberate. She paused, then shook her head. Not a refusal, but an apology, like a name was too much to give. "No name, then," Thomas said with a nod. "We'll just call you Guest for now." The faintest flicker crossed her lips, not quite a smile, but close enough to hint at one. Her eyes darted around the barn, sharp and quick, not like someone admiring the space, but someone mapping it. Exits, corners, angles. "You sleep with the door unlocked?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas met her gaze for a moment before answering. "Storm like this? Anyone looking to cause trouble wouldn't bother knocking." She gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. Minutes passed in silence before she spoke again. "That picture by the stairs," she said, her voice low, pointing to a faded black and white photo tacked to a post. It showed a younger Thomas, standing beside a shepherd dog and two men in uniform, dog tags glinting in the light. "That you?" "Yeah," he said, his voice softening with memory. "Long time ago." She didn't respond, but her fingers tightened around the mug. Thomas pulled another blanket from a trunk and draped it across the cot's far end. She reached for the first blanket, folding it with slow, deliberate precision, corners sharp, edges aligned, the kind of muscle memory that spoke of training. Thomas watched for a moment, then turned to the lantern. "I'll be in the house if you need me," he said. "Hear coyotes. Just bang the post a couple times." She looked up, her eyes steady. "You always help strangers in the dark?" Thomas paused, hand on the door. "Not always," he said, but tonight didn't feel like a night for questions. He stepped out, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud. Inside the barn, the girl sat still, the mug warm in her hands, the folded blanket beside her. For the first time that night, she seemed less like someone fleeing something, her shoulders just a fraction less tense. The rain slowed past midnight, dwindling to a misty drizzle, the wind softening to a low murmur across the fields. The heater crackled faintly, and the girl lay awake on the caw, her eyes tracing the rough beams overhead. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, not restless, but searching, as if the rough wool held some answer. Across the yard, a light in the farmhouse flicked on, then off, then on again. She sat up, silent as a shadow, and slipped off the cot. Barefoot, she moved to the narrow side window, her gaze sweeping the dark trees beyond the field, watchful, waiting. She crouched low, one hand pressed firmly against the rough wooden floor of the barn, steadying herself with a deliberate calm. The posture wasn't born of fear, but of discipline, honed through rigorous training. A faint creak broke the silence as the barn door eased open. Thomas Grady, a weathered man of 73, stood silhouetted in the doorway, clutching a neatly folded sweatshirt and a pair of dry socks. His voice was soft, careful not to disturb the stillness. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, his tone carrying the warmth of someone who knew the weight of unexpected sounds. "You didn't," the girl replied, her voice steady, betraying no surprise. She accepted the close with a quiet nod, her movements precise, almost mechanical. Thomas watched her for a moment, noting the way her eyes flicked toward the window, always scanning, always alert. "You get some rest?" he asked, gesturing toward the cot in the corner. "Storm's easing up." She gave a slight nod, her gaze lingering on the rain-streaked glass. "You still watching for something out there?" Thomas pressed gently, his curiosity tempered by a lifetime of discretion. She hesitated, her lips parting as if weighing her words, then countered with a question of her own. "That radio of yours? Still work?" Thomas tilted his head, studying her. "Out here, it's mostly static. I use it when the power's out. Weather updates, crop reports. You asking about interference?" His eyes narrowed slightly, catching the faintest shift in her expression. "Sometimes when the sky's clear, you pick up military chatter." She didn't flinch, didn't blink, but her silence spoke volumes. Thomas let the moment pass, choosing not to pry. Instead, he crossed the barn to a cluttered shelf, retrieving a dusty canteen. He handed it to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "You talk like someone who's seen more than most your age," he said, his voice carrying a quiet respect. She unscrewed the canteen's cap, took a slow sip, and met his gaze. "And you talk like someone who knows better than to ask too many questions." Her words were sharp but not unkind, a boundary drawn with precision. Thomas's lips curved into a faint, weathered smile. "I wasn't always a farmer," he admitted, his tone carrying the weight of years long past. Silence settled between them, not strained but full, like the quiet after a storm's peak. She glanced at the floor, then at the cot, her fingers tracing the edge of the canteen. "You served, didn't you? A long time ago. Does it ever fade?" Thomas's eyes drifted to the window, to the dark shapes of trees swaying in the distance. "No," he said after a pause, his voice low but firm. "It never leaves, but it gets quieter, like a voice you learn to live with." She nodded a single measured motion, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Thank you for not pushing, for not asking more than you needed to." Thomas stepped back toward the door, pausing in the threshold. "Truth is," he said, his voice softening, "if someone's desperate enough to walk through a storm like that, they've earned a night of peace." He left the door ajar, just a few inches, and disappeared into the night. Inside, she dragged the cot closer to the wall, her movements precise as she refolded the blankets, tucking the corners with military precision. She lay down, her body angled so she never turned her back to the door. Sleep didn't come. Her ears strained, not for danger, but for the hum of engines, the kind that cut through the wind. Just after midnight, the air shifted. The wind returned, not in a steady howl, but in sharp, pulsing bursts that seemed to ripple through the night itself. Dust swirled across the field in rhythmic waves, and the trees didn't sway. They quivered, as if trembling under an unseen weight. Thomas woke instantly, not stirred by sound but by instinct, a soldier's reflex buried deep in his bones. He sat up, shrugging his coat over his shoulders before his boots hit the floor. The window pane rattled once, then again, a low vibration humming through the house, rising from the earth like the echo of distant thunder. But this was no storm. He stepped onto the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The sky above the barn was no longer a void of black, but glowed with an eerie, unnatural white, as if the moon had fallen into his field. Then came the sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of the night itself. Rotor blades, heavy and unmistakable. Thomas's boots crunched against the wet gravel as he crossed the yard, the rain forgotten. Above the far side of the barn, a massive helicopter descended, its dark green hull glinting faintly under the glow of its own floodlights. Two rotors churned the air, sending mist and wind spiraling outward. The seal on its side was barely visible, but Thomas didn't need a clear view to recognize it. Marine One. The helicopter hovered just above the field, its lights sweeping over the barn and trees like a silent prayer searching for something holy. Hay barrels tipped and rolled. The tall grass flattened in waves. Thomas stood rooted, his breath steady, but his heart quickening. He hadn't seen a bird like that since his days overseas, and even then, only from a distance. He never imagined one would touch down on his land. Behind him, the barn door creaked open. The girl stepped out, the gray blanket draped over her shoulders, her eyes locked on the helicopter, with a look that said she'd been waiting for it all along. Two Marines emerged from the aircraft before its skids kissed the ground. One stood by the open bay, his posture rigid. The other approached, boots crunching the gravel in perfect cadence. Thomas didn't move, his eyes tracking the scene unfolding before him. The Marine stopped 6 feet from the girl, rain plastering his uniform to his frame, but he stood unyielding, a statue carved from duty. He raised his hand in a slow, precise salute. She returned it without hesitation, her motions sharp and flawless. Thomas felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the hairs rising as if the air itself had shifted. The Marine spoke, his voice cutting through the roar of the rotors. "Ma'am, we've been tracking your beacon for 14 hours. Orders were clear. We don't leave without you." She glanced at Thomas, her eyes meeting his for the first time with unguarded clarity, then turned back to the Marine. "I wasn't lost," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I just needed one night without running." The Marine nodded once, no questions, no arguments. Then he turned to Thomas, his tone softening but still formal. "Sir, thank you for keeping her safe." He reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope, extending it with care. Thomas took it without a word, the paper cool against his palm. The girl looked at Thomas one last time, her gaze steady, unguarded for the first time. "You didn't ask," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "That's why I stayed." Then she turned, walking up the ramp into the helicopter's glowing maw, swallowed by light and sound. Marine One rose slowly, its rotors carving through the mist before it banked and vanished into the clouds, a specter reclaiming its own. Thomas stood in the field long after the wind died down, the envelope unopened in his hand, the gravel beneath his boots muddy and warm from the jet wash. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared into the night sky, exhaling as if he'd just witnessed a secret slip from his barn into the annals of history. He didn't open the envelope right away. The silence of the night felt heavier now, the storm's absence leaving only the faint echo of rotors in his chest. The rain had stopped, as if its only purpose had been to deliver her to his door and then spirit her away. The barn's single light flickered once and went dark. Thomas walked back to the porch, the envelope pressed flat against his palm, its weight more than paper should carry. Inside the house, he set the envelope on the kitchen table, its edges crisp against the worn wood. He poured himself a cup of coffee, not because he craved it, but because the ritual gave his hands purpose. The house felt too quiet, the silence pressing against him like a living thing. He stood for a moment, staring at the envelope, then sat down and slid it closer. With the edge of a butter knife, he slid it open. Inside were two letters, one official, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, Office of Lures Hensley, the other handwritten, its script uneven but deliberate. He unfolded the first, his eyes tracing the words, each one carrying the weight of something meant to stay unspoken. The letter came from the Department of Defense, signed by a name he didn't recognize, Lure Hensley. It spoke of his unwitting role in a federal operation, commending him for sheltering someone under temporary military protection. The details were sparse, cloaked in the vagueness of classified matters, but the gratitude was clear. His discretion, his refusal to pry, had safeguarded someone whose sacrifices would never grace a headline. Thomas read it once, then again, letting the words sink in. He hadn't known he was part of anything larger than his own small world. Yet here was proof that his quiet kindness had mattered. Beside the official letter was another, smaller note, folded with precision, its handwriting neat but hurried, as if written in a stolen moment. It was from her, the girl, barely 18, who had appeared one stormy night, her eyes carrying a weight no young person should bear. She didn't sign her name, but her words were raw, unguarded. She thanked him for not asking questions, for not calling the authorities or demanding explanations. He'd simply opened his barn, checked the heater, and left her to the silence she so desperately needed. For 3 years, she wrote, she'd lived in a world of transactions, every gesture calculated, every kindness a prelude to interrogation. But Thomas had given her something rarer, a night to be just a girl, not a soldier, not a pawn, not a daughter carrying someone else's expectations. His silence had been her sanctuary, and she promised to carry his name with her, even if he'd never know hers. Thomas set the note down, his eyes drifting to the window. The sky was still dark, but a faint glow edged the horizon, hinting at dawn's approach. His face didn't break into a smile, but there was a softening in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of something he couldn't quite name. He folded both letters carefully, tucking them into their envelope, and crossed the room to a corner where an old wooden box sat. It was a relic, worn smooth by time, holding pieces of his life he rarely revisited. Medals from a war long past, dog tags, a faded photo of his unit, and a folded flag untouched for years. He slipped the envelope beneath the flag and closed the lid, the act feeling final, like sealing a promise. He didn't need to tell anyone what had happened that night. She'd already told him he'd made a difference, and that was enough. Dawn crept in slowly, as if unsure of its place after the storm that had battered the fields the night before. The clouds had parted, leaving streaks of pale orange across the sky. The fields shimmered with morning mist, and the barn stood quiet, its weathered boards still damp, as if the storm had been a fleeting dream too vast for this humble patch of earth. Thomas stood on his porch, cradling a chipped mug of hot water with a slice of lemon. His doctor's orders to cut back on coffee, which he'd mostly ignored until this morning, felt right for it. The gravel road beyond the yard was empty. No trace of the black SUVs or the Marine from Marine One who had escorted her away, only faint tire tracks pressed into the grass. His gaze settled on the barn, its door still slightly ajar. He'd meant to close it earlier but hadn't gotten around to it. Now, in the stillness, he crossed the yard, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Inside, the cot remained where she'd left it, the blanket folded with military precision, corners sharp, edges crisp. Above the workbench, something caught his eye. A dog tag, not his, not from his war, pinned to the wall with a single nail. It was a quiet gesture, unassuming, its etched numbers a code he couldn't decipher. But he didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a piece of her left behind, a weight she'd chosen to set down. He touched it lightly, just once, then left it there, hanging in the silence. Back in the house, Thomas sat at the table again, unfolding her note once more. He didn't read it this time, just let it rest beside an old army photo, the faded faces of his younger self and his comrades staring back. There was something grounding in seeing them together, his past in this fleeting moment of the present, linked not by the chaos of war, but by the quiet act of offering shelter. It felt right, like two chapters of a life that still held meaning. Later that morning, a neighbor's truck rumbled up, its engine loud enough to scatter the birds. The man stepped out, calling, "Morning, Tom. Heard some commotion last night. Thought maybe a transformer blew." Thomas shook his head, his voice steady. "Just the storm." The neighbor nodded, skeptical but not one to press. "You good?" he asked. Thomas glanced at the barn, then back to the porch. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm good now." The neighbor left after some small talk, the kind that fades as soon as it's spoken. But the letters, the dog tag, the folded blanket, they lingered. They were proof that sometimes the quietest acts carry the loudest weight, that doing right without fanfare can echo longer than words. The next morning brought unexpected sunlight, the storm a distant memory, as if it had only passed through to deliver her and then move on. The fields sparkled with dew, and the birds returned, their cautious chirps turning chatty. Even the barn seemed renewed, though Thomas hadn't touched it. He walked the pasture fence, checking posts out of habit, his steps slow and deliberate. The gate held firm, the posts unshaken. Near the old oak at the south end of the field, he stopped. Fresh boot prints marked the dirt, smaller than his, lighter, not military issue, but purposeful. She'd walked this way before leaving. He followed them a few yards to the edge of a clearing, where a small leather pouch lay half hidden in the grass, its drawstring pulled tight. Inside was a silver compass, its needle still quivering, and a single page torn from a field manual. No long message, just a phrase underlined in pencil. "Always know where you are, even when you don't know who you are." Thomas held the compass, its weight cool in his palm, and looked up at a sky now clear and blue, familiar in its vastness. He carried the pouch back to the barn, setting it beside the blanket on the cot. He didn't lock the door. Back at the house, he cleared a space on the mantel, placing the envelope and dog tag between the flag case and his unit's photo. No new frame, no label, just them, carrying the story in their quiet presence. Some stories aren't meant to be shouted or explained. They're meant to be held close, carried in the heart. Days later in town, a young boy in an oversized Marine Corps hoodie held a door open for him, offering a silent nod. Thomas nodded back, unsurprised, as if some unspoken understanding passed between them. Her name would never be spoken, her story never printed or verified, but it lived in the folded blanket, the dog tag on the nail, the compass by the cot. It lived in a farmer who asked for nothing and gave more than he knew, whose kindness had been enough for a girl who needed it most. And that was enough.